The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Royal Guard Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the third time that morning. At 28 years old, Thomas had served the British royal family for 6 years, and today marked his first assignment as personal protection for Queen Camilla during her private garden walkabout. His hands trembled slightly as he checked his ceremonial sword, not from fear of external threats, but from the weight of responsibility that came with protecting royalty. Thomas had grown up in a small village in Yorkshire, the son of a coal miner who had always dreamed of something greater for his boy. When Thomas announced his intention to join the Queen's Guard, his father had beamed with pride, telling everyone at the local pub that his son would be protecting the crown. The intensive training at the Guards depot had been grueling, but Thomas excelled, particularly in protocol and etiquette. His superiors noted his keen attention to detail and unwavering dedication to duty. The assignment brief had been straightforward enough. Queen Camilla would be taking her morning constitutional through the private gardens, reviewing the spring plantings with the head gardener, and Thomas would maintain a respectful distance while ensuring her safety. The Queen was known to prefer a more relaxed atmosphere during her private moments, unlike the formal state occasions where multiple guards maintained rigid positions. As Thomas took his position near the ornamental fountain, he noticed the Queen emerging from the castle's side entrance. She wore a flowing cream-colored dress with a matching cardigan, her silver hair catching the morning light. The head gardener, an elderly man named Robert who had served the royal household for over 30 years, approached with a clipboard and an enthusiastic smile. Queen Camilla had always been particular about the gardens. Since becoming queen consort, she had taken a personal interest in expanding the organic vegetable patches and ensuring the flower beds reflected seasonal British blooms. This morning's walk was part of her weekly routine, something that brought her genuine joy amid the countless official duties and public appearances. Thomas watched as the Queen and Robert moved from bed to bed, discussing the progress of the daffodils and the placement of new rose bushes. The conversation was animated, with Camilla gesturing toward different sections and Robert nodding enthusiastically. They paused at a newly planted herb garden, where the Queen knelt down to examine the young sage plants, her hands gently touching the leaves. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Margaret Thornberry, one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. Margaret was known throughout the household for her sharp tongue and even sharper opinions about protocol. At 62, she had served various members of the royal family for over 2 decades and considered herself an expert on proper royal behavior. Lady Margaret approached with quick, purposeful steps, her face showing clear disapproval. She had observed from a castle window and believed the Queen was spending too much time in casual conversation with the gardener. In Margaret's view, even private moments should maintain a certain level of formality befitting royal status. Thomas noticed the change in atmosphere immediately as Lady Margaret whispered something urgent into the Queen's ear. Camilla's expression shifted from contentment to mild annoyance, and she straightened up from examining the herbs. Robert, sensing the tension, stepped back respectfully and busied himself with his clipboard. The conversation between the Queen and Lady Margaret became more heated, though they kept their voices low. Thomas could see from his position that Lady Margaret was gesturing toward the castle, likely suggesting they return inside for some pressing matter. The Queen, however, seemed determined to continue her garden tour, waving her hand dismissively at whatever concerns were being raised. As the discussion continued, Thomas found himself in an awkward position. His training dictated that he should remain focused on potential external threats, but the clearly developing situation between the Queen and her lady-in-waiting was becoming impossible to ignore. He adjusted his position slightly to maintain visual contact with all parties while staying within his assigned perimeter. The head gardener, Robert, tried to excuse himself from the situation, bowing respectfully and indicating he could continue the tour at another time. However, Queen Camilla gestured for him to stay, apparently using the garden tour as a way to avoid whatever Lady Margaret was insisting upon. This only seemed to increase Margaret's frustration, as she believed the Queen was being deliberately stubborn. Thomas had heard stories from other guards about Lady Margaret's reputation for being overly controlling and sometimes forgetting the boundaries of her position. While ladies-in-waiting were meant to assist and advise, some veteran staff members had whispered that Margaret occasionally overstepped her role, treating the Queen more like a wayward child than the sovereign's wife. The situation escalated when Lady Margaret raised her voice slightly, forgetting momentarily that they were in the open gardens where sound carried. She expressed her view that the Queen's casual behavior was inappropriate and that there were important matters requiring immediate attention indoors. The Queen's response was firm but measured, stating that her garden time was sacred and would not be interrupted for non-urgent matters. Thomas watched as the Queen turned away from Lady Margaret and approached a section of newly planted bulbs, clearly trying to end the conversation. Robert, the gardener, looked thoroughly uncomfortable but followed the Queen's lead, beginning to explain the expected blooming timeline for the tulips they had planted. Lady Margaret, however, was not finished. She followed the Queen and continued to press her point, her voice carrying a tone of increasing frustration. She reminded the Queen of her afternoon appointments and suggested that the garden tour was taking too long. The Queen stopped abruptly, turned to face Lady Margaret, and, for a moment, the garden fell completely silent except for the sound of birds chirping in the nearby trees. Thomas realized he was witnessing something unusual. In all his training and experience, he had never seen such a direct confrontation between a member of the royal family and their staff. The tension in the air was palpable, and he found himself holding his breath, uncertain about what his role should be in such a situation. The Queen's voice, when she finally spoke, was controlled but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. She reminded Lady Margaret that as Queen, she would determine her own schedule and that the garden tour would continue as planned. She suggested that if there were urgent matters, they could be handled by other staff members or postponed until after her morning routine. Lady Margaret's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or continued frustration, Thomas couldn't tell. She appeared to be struggling with how to respond to being so clearly dismissed by the Queen. The head gardener looked as though he wished he could disappear into the flower beds, while Thomas remained frozen in his position, unsure whether to intervene or maintain his distance. The standoff continued for several long moments, with neither woman backing down. The Queen maintained her regal composure while making it clear that the conversation was over, while Lady Margaret seemed to be wrestling with her inability to get her way. The beautiful morning garden had become the stage for a battle of wills that would soon take an unexpected and shocking turn. Thomas could sense that something was about to happen, though he couldn't have predicted what would come next. The peaceful morning had transformed into something far more complex, and his role as protector was about to be tested in ways his training had never prepared him for. The stage was set for an incident that would reverberate through the royal household and beyond, changing everything for everyone involved in ways no one could have anticipated. The tension in the garden reached a breaking point when Lady Margaret took a step closer to Queen Camilla, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a private whisper but was still audible to Thomas from his position. Margaret's words were sharp and cutting, suggesting that the Queen's behavior was becoming increasingly difficult for the staff to manage and that King Charles would not approve of such casual disregard for protocol. Queen Camilla's eyes flashed with anger at the mention of her husband being brought into what she clearly viewed as a minor disagreement about garden time. The suggestion that Lady Margaret would report her behavior to the king was the final straw in what had been building as a confrontation about respect and authority within the royal household. Thomas watched in growing alarm as the Queen's composure began to crack. Her hands clenched at her sides, and her voice, when she responded, carried a tone he had never heard from any member of the royal family. She told Lady Margaret in no uncertain terms that she would not be spoken to like a child and that her position as lady-in-waiting did not give her the authority to dictate royal behavior. The head gardener, Robert, had backed away several steps and was pretending to examine a distant flower bed, clearly hoping to remove himself from the increasingly uncomfortable situation. Thomas found himself caught between his duty to protect the Queen and his uncertainty about whether this situation required his intervention. His training had covered external threats, assassination attempts, and crowd control, but nothing had prepared him for managing a domestic dispute between the Queen and her staff. Lady Margaret, rather than backing down, seemed to interpret the Queen's anger as confirmation that she was right about the inappropriate behavior. She straightened her shoulders and adopted what Thomas recognized as her most imperious tone, the one she used when dealing with junior staff members who had made mistakes. She reminded the Queen that certain standards had to be maintained, even during private moments, and that the reputation of the monarchy depended on consistent dignity. The Queen's response was swift and cutting. She pointed out that Lady Margaret seemed to have forgotten who she was speaking to and that no member of the household staff, regardless of their position or length of service, had the right to lecture the Queen on appropriate behavior. The words hung in the morning air like a challenge, and Thomas could see that Lady Margaret was struggling to process being spoken to so directly. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Thomas barely had time to register it. Lady Margaret, perhaps driven by years of accumulated frustration with what she saw as the Queen's increasingly casual approach to royal protocol, or perhaps simply unable to accept being dismissed so completely, stepped even closer to Queen Camilla. Her voice rose as she declared that someone needed to remind the Queen of her responsibilities and the importance of setting a proper example. The Queen took a step back, clearly startled by Lady Margaret's aggressive approach. For a moment, Thomas thought the confrontation might de-escalate, but Lady Margaret followed, continuing her lecture about royal duties and proper behavior. She gestured emphatically as she spoke, her movements becoming more animated with each word. Thomas made a split-second decision that would change everything. Seeing what he interpreted as an aggressive approach toward the Queen, he stepped forward from his position, moving between Lady Margaret and Queen Camilla. His training had taught him that any perceived threat to a royal family member required immediate action, and Lady Margaret's advancing posture and raised voice triggered his protective instincts. "Ma'am, please step back," Thomas said firmly, addressing Lady Margaret while positioning himself as a barrier between her and the Queen. His voice carried the authority of his position, and his physical presence immediately changed the dynamic of the confrontation. Lady Margaret stopped mid-sentence, clearly shocked that a guard had intervened in what she considered a private conversation with the Queen. Queen Camilla was equally surprised by Thomas's intervention. In her mind, the disagreement with Lady Margaret, while heated, was an internal household matter that didn't require protection from her security detail. The presence of the guard between herself and her lady-in-waiting suddenly made the situation feel much more serious and formal than she had intended. Lady Margaret's face went pale, then flushed again with what was clearly indignation. She looked at Thomas as though he had committed an unthinkable breach of protocol, which, in her view, he had. Guards were meant to protect against external threats, not interfere in conversations between the Queen and her staff. The fact that a young man she considered beneath her station had dared to interrupt and essentially give her orders was more than she could tolerate. "How dare you?" Lady Margaret said to Thomas, her voice shaking with rage. "You forget yourself, young man. This is not your place to interfere." She looked past him to Queen Camilla, expecting support for her position that the guard had overstepped his bounds. Thomas felt his confidence waver for the first time. He had acted on instinct, but now, faced with Lady Margaret's anger and the Queen's surprised expression, he began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. His training had emphasized the importance of protecting the royal family, but it had also stressed the equally important principle of knowing one's place in the complex hierarchy of the royal household. Queen Camilla found herself in an impossible position. On one hand, she was touched by Thomas's instinct to protect her, even if she felt protection wasn't necessary. On the other hand, she could see that his intervention had escalated the situation beyond what it needed to be. She was also acutely aware that Lady Margaret was technically correct about protocol. Guards typically did not involve themselves in household discussions unless specifically directed to do so. The Queen looked at Thomas with what he hoped was understanding and said gently, "Thank you, Thomas, but this isn't necessary. Lady Margaret and I are simply having a discussion." Her tone was kind but carried a clear message that he should step back to his original position. Thomas immediately began to retreat, embarrassed by his error in judgment. He had acted with good intentions, but he now realized he had misread the situation entirely. As he stepped back, he began to apologize. "Your Majesty, I apologize for overstepping." But Lady Margaret was not finished with him. The fact that he had dared to interfere in her conversation with the Queen, combined with her existing frustration with the entire morning's events, had pushed her beyond her usual controlled demeanor. As Thomas moved to return to his position, she reached out and grabbed his arm. "You need to learn your place," she said sharply, her grip tight on his uniform sleeve. "Guards do not interfere in royal household matters." This kind of presumption is exactly what's wrong with the younger generation of staff. Thomas was stunned by the physical contact and the harsh words. He had never been addressed so aggressively by any member of the royal household, and he wasn't sure how to respond. His instinct was to pull away from her grip, but his training also emphasized respect for all members of the royal household, regardless of their behavior toward him. Queen Camilla watched this interaction with growing alarm. While she had been annoyed with Lady Margaret's earlier behavior, seeing her lady-in-waiting physically grab and berate a young guard who had been trying to do his job was crossing a line she couldn't tolerate. The situation had spiraled far beyond a simple disagreement about garden time. "Margaret, release him immediately," the Queen said, her voice carrying unmistakable royal authority. "This has gone quite far enough." Lady Margaret, however, seemed beyond reason. The morning's frustrations, combined with what she saw as a complete breakdown in proper protocol, had pushed her to a point where she was no longer thinking clearly about consequences or appropriate behavior. Instead of releasing Thomas, she tightened her grip and turned toward the Queen with fire in her eyes. "This is exactly what I mean about maintaining standards," Lady Margaret declared. "If guards think they can interfere in royal conversations, if protocol means nothing, then where does it end? Someone has to take a stand." The head gardener, Robert, had moved even further away and was now barely visible behind a large hedge, clearly wanting no part of whatever was unfolding. The peaceful morning garden had become the setting for a confrontation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Thomas felt trapped between his desire to maintain respectful behavior toward Lady Margaret despite her treatment of him, his duty to follow the Queen's direction, and his growing discomfort with the physical restraint. The situation had become surreal, unlike anything covered in his extensive training, and he found himself looking to Queen Camilla for guidance on how to proceed. The Queen's expression had shifted from surprise to concern to something approaching anger as she watched Lady Margaret continue to grip Thomas's arm while lecturing both of them about protocol and standards. The irony that Margaret was violating numerous protocols herself while complaining about others' behavior was not lost on Queen Camilla. What none of them could have predicted was that this confrontation was about to take an even more dramatic turn, one that would shock everyone present and create ripples throughout the royal household. The stage was set for an incident that would test relationships, challenge assumptions about authority and respect, and ultimately lead to consequences no one could have foreseen. The confrontation reached its climax when Lady Margaret, still gripping Thomas's arm, made a fatal error in judgment. Emboldened by what she perceived as a complete breakdown in royal household order and driven by years of accumulated frustration with changing protocols, she decided to take matters into her own hands. Looking directly at Queen Camilla, she declared that if no one else would maintain proper standards, she would have to do it herself. Before anyone could react, Lady Margaret raised her free hand and delivered a sharp slap across Thomas's face. The sound echoed through the garden like a gunshot, followed by a silence so complete that even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Thomas's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, his cheek immediately reddening with the clear outline of Margaret's palm. Queen Camilla gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. In all her years of royal life, through countless protocol breaches and staff difficulties, she had never witnessed such an outrageous display of violence against a member of her security detail. The young guard stood frozen, his face burning not just from the physical blow but from the humiliation of being struck in front of the Queen. Thomas felt tears of shock and embarrassment welling in his eyes, though his training helped him maintain his composure. His cheek throbbed painfully, but the emotional impact was far worse than the physical pain. He had joined the Queen's Guard with such pride, such dedication to serving the crown, and now he stood in the royal gardens having been publicly humiliated by a lady-in-waiting for simply trying to do his job. Lady Margaret seemed as shocked by her own action as everyone else, but rather than immediately apologizing, she attempted to justify her behavior. "Perhaps now you'll remember your place," she said to Thomas, though her voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. She finally released his arm and stepped back, appearing to realize for the first time the magnitude of what she had done. The head gardener, Robert, had witnessed the entire incident from behind his hedge and was now staring in complete disbelief. In over 30 years of service to the royal household, he had never seen anything remotely resembling such behavior. He looked between the Queen, the stunned guard, and Lady Margaret, unsure whether he should intervene, retreat further, or pretend he hadn't seen anything at all. Queen Camilla's shock quickly transformed into something much more powerful, righteous anger. The sight of a young man who had sworn to protect her being struck by one of her own staff members triggered a response that surprised even herself. This wasn't just about protocol or respect anymore, it was about basic human decency and the protection of those who served the crown faithfully. Lady Margaret, Queen Camilla said, her voice carrying a tone of royal authority that made everyone in the garden stand straighter, what you have just done is absolutely unacceptable. The Queen moved toward Thomas, her maternal instincts overriding all considerations of protocol. She gently touched his shoulder and examined his reddened cheek with genuine concern. "Are you all right, Thomas?" she asked softly, using his first name for the first time since their introduction that morning. The personal attention from the Queen in the wake of such humiliation brought fresh tears to Thomas's eyes, though he fought to maintain his composure. "Yes, Your Majesty," he managed to say, though his voice was somewhat shaky. "I'm perfectly fine." The lie was obvious to everyone present, but his attempt to maintain dignity in the face of such treatment only made Queen Camilla more determined to address the situation properly. Lady Margaret watched this interaction with growing alarm. She was beginning to understand that her impulsive action had consequences far beyond what she had considered in her moment of anger. The Queen's obvious concern for the young guard and her cold tone when addressing her lady-in-waiting made it clear that Margaret had crossed a line from which there might be no return. "Your Majesty," Lady Margaret began, attempting to regain some control over the situation, "I was simply trying to maintain proper order." The young man overstepped his bounds, and someone needed to. "Enough!" Queen Camilla's single word cut through Lady Margaret's explanation like a blade. The Queen's eyes flashed with an intensity that reminded everyone present that beneath the kind exterior was a woman who had not gained her position through weakness. "There is no excuse, none whatsoever, for laying hands on any member of my staff, regardless of the circumstances." Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions as he listened to the Queen defend him. Relief that she wasn't angry with him for his earlier intervention, gratitude for her protection, but also deep embarrassment that the situation had escalated to this point. He had wanted his first solo assignment with Queen Camilla to be perfect, to prove himself worthy of the trust placed in him. Instead, it had become a disaster that would likely follow him throughout his career. The Queen continued her rebuke of Lady Margaret, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Your behavior this morning has been inappropriate from the beginning. Your disrespect toward me might have been overlooked as a momentary lapse in judgment, but your treatment of Thomas is inexcusable. He was performing his duty as he understood it, trying to ensure my safety, and you responded with violence." Lady Margaret's face had gone pale except for two bright spots of color high on her cheeks. She was beginning to understand the full implications of her actions. Striking a member of the Queen's Guard was not just a breach of protocol, it was potentially a criminal assault. More importantly, she had done it in front of the Queen herself, making it impossible to minimize or explain away. I apologize, Your Majesty," Lady Margaret stammered, though her apology sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I was not thinking clearly. The stress of maintaining proper protocols, the pressure of ensuring everything runs smoothly, it overwhelmed me for a moment." Queen Camilla studied Lady Margaret's face carefully, searching for genuine remorse but finding mostly fear about consequences. The Queen had dealt with difficult staff members before, but nothing quite like this. The situation required a response that would send a clear message about acceptable behavior while also protecting Thomas from any further humiliation. "Your apology is noted," Queen Camilla said coolly, "but it does not undo what has occurred here. Thomas, I want you to know that your actions this morning, while perhaps not necessary in this particular situation, came from a place of dedication to duty that I both recognize and appreciate. You have nothing to apologize for." The validation from the Queen meant everything to Thomas. Despite the physical pain and emotional trauma of being slapped, knowing that Queen Camilla understood his motivations and didn't blame him for the morning's events gave him a measure of comfort. He stood a little straighter and managed to meet the Queen's eyes as he thanked her for her understanding. Robert, the head gardener, had slowly emerged from behind his hedge, recognizing that the immediate crisis seemed to have passed. However, he remained at a respectful distance, clearly uncertain about whether his presence was welcome or if he should retreat to allow the royal party to handle the situation privately. Queen Camilla noticed Robert's hesitation and gestured for him to approach. "Robert, I believe we should postpone the remainder of our garden tour. There are some matters that require immediate attention." Her tone was gentle with the gardener, making it clear that her anger was specifically directed at Lady Margaret's behavior, not at anyone else who had been present. "Of course, Your Majesty," Robert replied, bowing slightly. "Perhaps we could continue another day when circumstances are more suitable." His diplomatic phrasing showed the wisdom that had kept him employed by the royal household for 3 decades. As the group prepared to return to the castle, Queen Camilla made a decision that would prove to be pivotal. Rather than handling the situation quietly within the household, as might have been traditional, she decided that such behavior required official attention. The sight of Thomas's still reddened cheek and the memory of Lady Margaret's shocking aggression convinced her that this could not be swept under the rug. "Lady Margaret," Queen Camilla said formally, "you will return to the castle immediately and remain in your quarters until further notice. I will be discussing this incident with His Majesty, and there will undoubtedly be consequences for your actions today." The mention of involving King Charles sent a chill through Lady Margaret. She had hoped that the matter might be handled quietly, perhaps with a private reprimand and an agreement to behave more appropriately in the future. The prospect of facing the king's judgment for striking a member of his wife's security detail was terrifying. Thomas felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about the king being informed. On one hand, he was grateful that Queen Camilla was taking the situation seriously enough to involve her husband. On the other hand, he worried about what King Charles's reaction might be and how it might affect his own career prospects within the royal household. The small group began walking back toward the castle, the beautiful spring morning now overshadowed by the dramatic events that had unfolded in the garden. None of them could have predicted how the king's response would ultimately reshape their understanding of justice, authority, and loyalty within the royal household. The stage was set for a final act that would prove even more surprising than what they had already experienced. King Charles was in his private study reviewing correspondence when Queen Camilla entered, her face still showing signs of the morning's distressing events. He immediately noticed her agitated state and set aside his papers, giving her his complete attention. The king had learned over their many years together to recognize when his wife was dealing with something serious, and her expression left no doubt that this was one of those moments. "Charles," Queen Camilla began, settling into the chair across from his desk, "we need to discuss something that happened this morning during my garden walk. Something completely unacceptable." She proceeded to recount the entire incident, from Lady Margaret's initial interference through the escalating confrontation to the shocking moment when she slapped Thomas. As Queen Camilla told the story, King Charles's expression grew increasingly grave. He listened without interruption, occasionally raising an eyebrow or leaning forward when particularly disturbing details emerged. When she reached the moment of Lady Margaret striking the guard, the king's jaw tightened visibly, and his hands clenched into fists on his desk. "She struck one of our guards?" King Charles asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that Queen Camilla rarely heard. "A young man who was simply trying to perform his duty." The concept was so foreign to his understanding of proper behavior within the royal household that he needed confirmation before he could fully process it. Queen Camilla nodded solemnly. "I saw it myself, Charles." The sound echoed through the entire garden. Poor Thomas just stood there, his cheek bright red, trying so hard to maintain his composure. It was heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. She could feel her own anger returning as she relived the memory. The king stood and began pacing behind his desk, a habit he had developed when dealing with particularly troubling situations. The idea that someone entrusted with caring for his wife could behave so abominably toward a member of their security detail violated every principle he held dear about leadership, respect, and the proper treatment of those who served the crown. "Where is Lady Margaret now?" King Charles asked, his voice controlled but carrying unmistakable authority. Queen Camilla explained that she had sent Margaret to her quarters to await further instructions. The king nodded approvingly at his wife's handling of the immediate situation, but it was clear that he intended to take additional action. "And the guard, Thomas? How is he?" The king's concern for the young man's welfare was genuine. Having served in the military himself, King Charles understood the dedication required to serve in protective roles and felt a particular responsibility toward those who put themselves at risk for the royal family's safety. Queen Camilla's expression softened as she thought of Thomas's brave attempt to maintain his dignity despite the humiliation he had suffered. "He's a good young man, Charles." He was embarrassed, of course, but he handled himself with remarkable grace under the circumstances. I was quite impressed with his character, actually. King Charles stopped pacing and looked directly at his wife. This cannot stand, Camilla. If we allow staff members to assault our security personnel without significant consequences, we undermine the entire structure of trust and respect that allows our household to function. Thomas needs to know that we value his service and will protect him from such treatment. The Queen agreed completely, though she was curious about what specific actions her husband had in mind. King Charles had always been thoughtful about justice, preferring measured responses to knee-jerk reactions, but she could see that this situation had triggered something deeper in him. The violation of trust and the abuse of power represented everything he opposed in leadership. I want to speak with Thomas first, King Charles decided. I need to hear his account of events and ensure he understands that his actions were appropriate under the circumstances. Then, I'll deal with Lady Margaret. The king's tone made it clear that Lady Margaret's future with the royal household was very much in question. Within an hour, Thomas found himself standing in the king's private study, still somewhat in shock from the morning's events. He had been told only that His Majesty wished to speak with him personally about the incident in the garden. Despite Queen Camilla's earlier reassurances, Thomas couldn't shake his anxiety about how the king might view his role in the confrontation. King Charles gestured for Thomas to sit, immediately setting a tone that was formal but not intimidating. Thomas, I've heard from Queen Camilla about this morning's events, but I'd like to hear your perspective. Please, tell me exactly what happened from your point of view. Thomas carefully recounted the morning's events, being scrupulously honest about his decision to intervene when he perceived Lady Margaret as being aggressive toward the Queen. He admitted his uncertainty about whether intervention was appropriate and his embarrassment about potentially overstepping his bounds. When he reached the moment of being slapped, his voice faltered slightly, but he pressed on to complete his account. King Charles listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly allowing Thomas to tell his story without interruption. When the young guard finished, the king leaned back in his chair and studied him thoughtfully for several moments. Thomas waited nervously, unsure what judgment might be coming. Thomas, King Charles finally said, I want you to understand something very clearly. Your instinct to protect Queen Camilla, even when protection might not have been strictly necessary, reflects exactly the kind of dedication and vigilance we need from our security personnel. You acted on your training and your commitment to duty, and there is nothing to apologize for in that. The relief that washed over Thomas's face was immediate and profound. He had been carrying guilt about his intervention all morning, second-guessing his decision and wondering if his career was over before it had truly begun. Hearing the king validate his actions lifted a tremendous weight from his shoulders. However, King Charles continued, his expression hardening, what happened to you afterward is absolutely unacceptable. No member of this household has the right to lay hands on you in anger, regardless of their position or their grievances. Lady Margaret's behavior was not only inappropriate but potentially criminal, and it will be addressed accordingly. Thomas felt a complex mixture of gratitude and apprehension. While he was relieved to know that the royal family supported him, he also worried about the potential fallout from whatever consequences Lady Margaret might face. He had never wanted to be the cause of someone losing their position, even someone who had treated him so badly. Your Majesty, Thomas said hesitantly, I don't want Lady Margaret to face severe consequences because of me. I know she was frustrated, and, perhaps. King Charles held up a hand to stop him. Thomas, your compassion speaks well of your character, but this is not about you seeking revenge or punishment. This is about maintaining standards of behavior that allow our household to function properly and safely. Lady Margaret's actions today violated those standards in a way that cannot be overlooked. The king stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where the morning's drama had unfolded. Those who serve the crown, whether in security, household management, or any other capacity, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. When that principle is violated, especially so flagrantly, we must respond decisively to prevent it from happening again. Thomas began to understand that this was about much more than just his personal experience. King Charles was thinking about the broader implications for everyone who worked within the royal household. The king's response would send a message about what kind of behavior would be tolerated and what consequences would follow when lines were crossed. "What will happen to Lady Margaret?" Thomas asked, partly out of curiosity and partly from lingering concern about being the catalyst for someone else's downfall. King Charles turned back to face him. "Lady Margaret will be dismissed from royal service immediately. Her behavior today was the culmination of a pattern of overreaching her authority and treating staff members inappropriately. This incident simply made it impossible to ignore any longer." The finality in the king's voice made it clear that this decision was not open for debate. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and sadness, relief that he wouldn't have to work alongside someone who had humiliated him so publicly, but sadness that a career spanning decades was ending in such disgrace. Furthermore, King Charles continued, "I want you to know that this incident will have no negative impact on your career prospects. If anything, your professionalism in handling such a difficult situation reflects well on your character and your commitment to service." Over the following days, the news of Lady Margaret's dismissal spread through the royal household like wildfire. Staff members who had endured her harsh treatment over the years felt a sense of vindication, while others worried about what her departure might mean for household operations. The king's swift and decisive action sent a clear message about his expectations for how staff members should treat each other. Thomas returned to his duties with a new understanding of his place within the royal household hierarchy. The incident had been traumatic, but the royal family's response had shown him that loyalty and dedication would be rewarded with protection and respect. He carried himself with more confidence, knowing that he had the support of those he served. Queen Camilla resumed her garden walks with Thomas as her guard, and their professional relationship was strengthened by the shared experience of that dramatic morning. She made a point of treating him with the same warmth and respect she had shown after the incident, ensuring that he never felt diminished by what had happened. The garden itself became a symbol of renewal and proper order. The spring flowers continued to bloom, the herb garden flourished, and the peaceful atmosphere was restored. But, for those who had witnessed the events of that morning, the beautiful setting would always carry the memory of a day when principles were tested and justice prevailed. King Charles's reaction had indeed stunned everyone involved, but not because it was harsh or unexpected. Rather, his swift defense of a young guard against the abuse of authority, combined with his clear articulation of principles about dignity and respect, demonstrated the kind of leadership that inspired genuine loyalty rather than mere obedience. The incident became part of royal household lore, a story told to new staff members as an example of how the crown protects those who serve faithfully and how quickly consequences follow when that service is not properly valued. Thomas went on to have a distinguished career in royal protection, always carrying with him the memory of a king who stood up for what was right when it mattered most.